The gavel struck once, sharp and dismissive, slicing through the stillness of the courtroom like a blade. "Remove it," the judge said flatly, his voice neither raised nor polite, only cold, commanding. For a moment, no one moved. The man standing before him didn't flinch, didn't speak, didn't even shift the weight of his immaculate white-gloved hands resting on the hilt of his ceremonial sword. His face remained carved in the same unwavering composure he had worn since the moment he entered the room. The Medal of Honor glinted faintly on his chest, catching the dim courthouse light, a single point of brilliance in a sea of oak-paneled walls and solemn faces. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, stretching too long, heavy enough to make the air itself feel tense. The judge leaned forward. "That medal, remove it before we proceed." A low murmur rippled from the gallery benches, but quickly died. People weren't sure if they had truly heard what had just been said. They looked from the judge to the soldier, to the medal itself, that small sky-blue ribbon that bore more weight than any courtroom rule or robe ever could. Still, the soldier said nothing. The bailiff's jaw tightened. Two attorneys exchanged uneasy glances. So Ainsley glanced, and somewhere near the back, an older veteran shifted in his seat, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his cane. The judge's voice cut again, sharper this time. "I will not repeat myself." The man before him, the tomb guard, neither argued nor protested. He only lowered his gaze briefly, not in submission, but in thought. And then slowly, deliberately, his gloved fingers brushed the edge of the medal, as if weighing the command against something deeper. To the untrained eye, his silence might have looked like hesitation. But to anyone who understood men like him, it was something else entirely, an unyielding calm, the same calm carried at midnight vigils and beside headstones no one dares to touch. And in that pause, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. His name was Daniel Hale. Hale. To most people in this courtroom, it was just another name, unremarkable, not yet connected to the storm that was about to break. He stood taller than the men who had ordered him around, not by height alone, but by the invisible weight of discipline and sacrifice forged over years of service. His uniform was a work of art, not in the way of fashion, but of devotion, not a thread out of place, not a single speck of lint daring to cling. The badge of the tomb guard, earned through sweat and sleepless nights, rested proudly on his shoulder. And above his heart, that light blue ribbon with its golden star, the Medal of Honor, seemed almost too heavy for even him to bear. It had been given to him after an act few people dared to speak of fully, because words had a way of diminishing moments like that. It wasn't for surviving an ambush or taking a hill. It was for holding his ground when others couldn't, for shielding not himself, but those behind him, with nothing more than his body and a stubborn refusal to move. That day had left scars no uniform could hide. A jagged line above his left ear, where shrapnel had stolen most of his hearing, a stiffness in his right hand, which had never fully recovered its strength, and the eyes, always the eyes, carrying that unspoken weight that only men who've buried brothers carry. He had never asked for the medal. When it was placed around his neck, he had simply saluted, not for himself, but for the men who weren't there to stand beside him. Now, here he stood, ordered to strip it off. The courtroom felt too small for what was happening. Bang it. The stale air smelled faintly of coffee and old wood polish, and the walls seemed to close in as if they too disapproved of the judge's demand. There were rules, of course. The judge wasn't wrong to speak of a protocol. In his courtroom, no one wore decorations, insignia, or symbols that might sway perception. But there was something about the way he had said it, dismissive, detached, that cut deeper than any rulebook ever could. The judge hadn't asked. He hadn't acknowledged the medal for what it meant, hadn't even looked the soldier in the eye when he spoke. He had simply ordered. And there was something profoundly wrong about that. Daniel's silence was not rebellion. It was the silence of a man weighing every possible response, not for his sake, but for the dignity of the uniform he wore and the honor he represented. He thought of Arlington, of standing watch in the rain so cold it made his bones ache, of walking the mat in the stillness of the night with only the sound of his steps and his heartbeat. Tomb guards did not speak. They did not complain. They held their silence like a sacred vow. Frenum. That same silence now held the courtroom hostage. To understand the weight of this moment, you'd have to understand Daniel's life before this day. Before the medal, before the tomb, before the courtroom. He was the son of a farmer from Kentucky, raised in fields where the sun baked the earth and the smell of hay clung to every stitch of clothing. He learned early that work meant sweat, that silence often said more than words, and that when you gave your word, you kept it. His father had served too. Had served, not in a celebrated way, not with medals or ceremonies, but quietly. A Vietnam vet who never boasted, who just came home, built a life, and taught his son that service wasn't about glory. Daniel enlisted young, barely out of high school. His first deployment took him halfway across the world, into a land of dust and heat where every breath tasted like sand and gun oil. He saw things there that no one his age should have to see, but he endured. And somewhere between the long patrols and the impossible missions, he found himself changing. He learned to read the air before danger came, to hear the shift in the wind before the storm broke. He learned what it meant to lead, not with shouts, but with quiet steadiness that made others follow, even into fire. The day that earned him the Medal of Honor came years later. It had been a convoy ambush, sudden, violent, and merciless. The details were whispered, not shouted, in military halls. All anyone knew for sure was that Daniel had stayed behind when he could have run, had shielded the wounded when he could have saved himself. And when rescue finally came, he had been standing. Barely, but standing all the same. He had never forgiven himself for those who didn't come home. That was the part people didn't understand about men like Daniel. The medal didn't feel like honor. It felt like memory. Now in this courtroom, every eye was on him. The judge drummed his fingers against the bench. The sound was faint, but to Daniel, with his partial hearing, it was a dull, irritating thump, like a distant heartbeat out of rhythm. Mr. Hale, the judge said again, voice clipped, impatient. I'll remove that medal. But still Daniel didn't move. He wasn't being defiant. He was being deliberate. In his mind, he could hear the words of his old drill sergeant, rough and unwavering. A tomb guard's silence speaks louder than any words. Use it wisely. So Daniel stood, unmoving, his eyes steady, his breathing even. And in that silence, the room began to shift. A discomfort creeping into the faces of those watching, as if they were realizing something they hadn't before. This wasn't about a rule. This was about respect. And respect, or the lack of it, had consequences. Would you like me to continue with part 2, where the judge presses harder, the tension thickens, and Daniel's last name begins to foreshadow the storm that will turn the courtroom on its head? You said, Part 2, ChatGPT said. The judge's tone sharpened, slicing through the thick silence. Sergeant Hale, he said, the syllables clipped as if they offended his mouth. This courtroom has rules. No insignia, no displays. That medal will come off, or I will hold you in contempt. The words fell like stones, hard and heavy, but the man they were meant to crush did not even blink. Daniel Hale remained still, a monument in dark blue wool and white gloves. His chest rose and fell with the measured calm of someone who had faced worse storms than this. He had stood in places where the sky itself seemed to fall apart, places where contempt was measured not in threats, but in bullets, and yet his silence was not the silence of arrogance. So it was a deeper kind, the silence of a man who understood that words, once given to anger, could never be taken back. The judge leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. He was used to obedience, to people scrambling to comply. But this soldier, this young man standing before him, was not scrambling. He wasn't arguing either. He was just there, unmoving, unshakable. The attorneys shifted in their seats. One of them, a gray-haired defense lawyer, opened his mouth as if to speak, then thought better of it. The prosecutor, younger and nervous, adjusted her papers but didn't meet Daniel's eyes. Even the bailiff, a thick-set man in his 40s, shifted his weight uncomfortably. He, too, had served once. You could tell by the way his back straightened when Daniel entered the room, by the subtle flicker of recognition when he saw the tomb guard's badge. The gallery was a patchwork of strangers. A handful of reporters, a scattering of curious locals, and near the back, a row of veterans. They wore baseball caps embroidered with the faded names of ships and units, their bodies bent with age but their eyes sharp, alive. One of them muttered under his breath. Another shook his head slowly, disbelief written in the deep creases of his weathered face. But no one spoke up. It was as if the whole room had agreed, silently, to let the tension stretch, to see who would break first. Daniel's silence had been forged long before this day, long before this courtroom. He had been trained for it. At Arlington National Cemetery, silence wasn't just expected, it was sacred. It was sacred. The tomb of the unknown soldier wasn't guarded by men who liked to talk. It was guarded by men like Daniel. Men who knew the power of stillness, who understood that a bowed head and a steady step could say more than 1,000 speeches. Becoming a tomb guard wasn't an assignment. It was a calling. The training was brutal, almost monastic. Weeks bled into months as recruits learned to march with absolute precision, their steps measured to fractions of inches. They learned to endure heat, cold, and pain without flinching. They learned that the tomb came first, always. Daniel had passed that training not because he was the strongest, but because he was the most relentless. There had been nights when his legs shook so violently after hours of drilling that he could barely climb the barracks stairs. Days when sweat stung his eyes and the sun beat down on the mat like a hammer. But he never broke, and when, at last, he earned the badge, that small heavy emblem that now gleamed on his shoulder, he understood its weight, to where it meant to carry more than yourself. It meant to stand for all those who had no voice left. That was the silence he brought into this courtroom. The judge mistook that silence for defiance. For defiance, for defiance. His lips pressed into a thin line, his hand curling around the gavel, as if to remind everyone who held the authority here. "Or bailiff," he said, not looking away from Daniel. "Assist the sergeant in complying with this order." A stir rippled through the room. The bailiff hesitated. His jaw worked as though grinding down words he couldn't say. Slowly, heavily, he stepped forward. Daniel didn't move. When the bailiff reached him, he looked up, just slightly, and their eyes met. Something passed between them. Not words, not even an expression, just a flicker of understanding. The bailiff stopped. The medal rested there, just inches away, shining against the crisp blue of Daniel's uniform. For a moment, the man reached for it, but his hand hovered in the air, unwilling to close the gap. The silence deepened. The veterans in the back row sat straighter. One of them removed his cap, holding it against his chest without realizing it. The judge's voice broke the quiet again, sharper this time. "Is there a problem, officer?" The bailiff lowered his hand. "Sir," he paused, his throat tight. "This is the Medal of Honor." The words were simple, but they hit the courtroom like a hammer. Everyone knew what the medal was, of course. But hearing it named out loud seemed to change the air itself. For the first time, the judge's gaze truly settled on it. The light blue ribbon, the golden star. It should have meant something in that moment. But instead, the judge hardened. "I am aware," he said curtly. "And in my courtroom, it comes off." Daniel still hadn't spoken. He simply stood there, hands folded at his waist, the faintest shift in his breathing, the only sign that the words had reached him at all. The silence was beginning to feel unbearable now. People shifted in their seats, coughed softly, stared at the floor. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh, why doesn't he just say something?" But those who understood knew why. Tomb guards didn't speak unless they had to. And Daniel Hale had learned long ago that sometimes the absence of words held the greatest power. Would you like me to continue with part 3, where the tension finally cracks, the judge demands his name, and the revelation of Daniel's last name changes everything? You said, part 3 ChatGPT said. The judge's patience was thinning like ice beneath a warm sun. He leaned forward, the wood of the bench creaking softly beneath his weight, his fingers drumming a slow, irritated beat. "A sergeant," he said, his voice like a cold blade. "You will comply or you will be removed. I will not repeat myself." Still Daniel Hale didn't move. His stillness had begun to feel like defiance to those who didn't understand it, but to those who did, it was something different, something heavier. It wasn't rebellion. It was duty. The courtroom shifted with quiet discomfort. The veterans in the back row seemed to hold their breath. The younger prosecutor, who had been flipping through her papers to avoid eye contact, stilled her hands. The bailiff stepped back, torn between the authority of the bench and the quiet honor standing before him. The judge's eyes narrowed further. His authority had been challenged in ways before, but always with words, shouted, argued, spat words. This was different. The absence of words unnerved him. Finally, his voice rose, not in volume, but in a kind of biting sharpness that made even the air feel brittle. "Sergeant, state your name for the record." Daniel's head tilted slightly, and for the first time his voice deep, even, unhurried, filled the courtroom. "Hale," he said simply. A single syllable, a single sound, but it was enough to send a ripple through the air. The judge froze. His fingers stopped drumming. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He blinked once, twice. "Hale," he repeated, the word tasting strange in his mouth, as if he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. Daniel didn't elaborate. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. The silence stretched until someone in the back, a frail man with a navy cap too big for his thinning head, whispered, almost reverently, "Did he say Hale?" Another veteran beside him sat forward, his gnarled hands gripping the pew in front of him. In an instant, the weight of the name began to settle over the room. The judge's stern face flickered, just for a moment, with something softer, recognition, or maybe disbelief. He leaned back slightly. "Your full name," he demanded, though the edge in his voice had dulled. Daniel's gaze stayed steady. "Daniel Robert Hale," he answered, and then added, after a pause that felt like thunder rolling over distant hills, "a grandson of Colonel James Hale." The courtroom was no longer silent. It was hushed in the way a chapel is hushed, the air charged with reverence that no one spoke aloud. The name Colonel James Hale was not one that faded easily. It was written into war memorials and buried deep in military archives, a name spoken with quiet respect in halls where soldiers gathered. He had been the man who decades ago led a desperate evacuation, holding a narrow mountain pass long enough for hundreds of soldiers to escape. He had been the man who never came back from that pass. The judge's face had gone pale. His hand, once clenched around the gavel, now rested limp. He remembered the name. Everyone who had ever studied military history remembered the name, and now, standing in his courtroom in the blue and white of the Tomb Guard uniform, wearing the Medal of Honor, was the grandson of that man. The judge's throat tightened. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words faltered before they could take shape. The veterans in the back row didn't falter. One by one, they rose, not loudly, not with fanfare, but with the quiet dignity of men who understood what deserved to be honored. Hats came off, backs straightened. The younger prosecutor slowly stood as well, setting her papers aside. The defense attorney followed. Only the judge remained seated, frozen in the weight of what he had just tried to strip away. The bailiff's voice, low and steady, broke the stillness. "Sir, maybe we should reconsider." But reconsideration was already in the air. It was in the way the veteran's eyes softened when they looked at Daniel. It was in the way the spectators' discomfort shifted into shame. It was in the way the name Hale seemed to fill every corner of the courtroom, like an unspoken command. Daniel didn't move. He didn't speak again. He didn't have to. His silence had said enough.